The first thing Instructor Vora Beksan noticed about the new batch of cadets was the usual assortment of nervous antennae, trembling gill flaps, and at least one species whose entire body changed color to a pale, panicked beige upon seeing the simulation chamber door. Normal. Perfectly, beautifully normal. Vora had been running the Galactic Interspecies Military Academy's survival module for 11 cycles now. 11 cycles of watching highly intelligent beings from across the known universe completely fall apart inside a room that was technically not even real. The simulation was her masterpiece. The simulation was her pride. The simulation was, according to the Academy's own marketing brochure, a psychologically calibrated environmental stress test designed to push recruits beyond their species-specific comfort thresholds. In plain language, it was a room designed to make you cry. And it worked. Oh, it worked beautifully. She tapped her data slate as the 23 cadets filed into the briefing hall, their boots clicking unevenly on the metal floor. 23 cadets, 11 different species, one shared expression of mounting dread. She loved this part. This was her favorite part, the part before they knew what was coming. "Welcome," she said, and her translator implant rendered her voice into whatever frequency each species required. "I am Instructor Vora Beksan. You will address me as Instructor, or if you are feeling particularly brave, you may try my name. Most cadets forget it after their first hour inside the chamber, so do not worry too much about memorizing it." She let that sit for a moment. The beige creature got slightly more beige. "Behind me," Vora continued, gesturing to the enormous sealed door that dominated the far wall, "is Simulation Grid 7. You will spend the next 48 standard hours inside it. You will face conditions drawn from the most hostile environments on record across 47 known worlds. Temperature extremes, atmospheric instability, predatory wildlife reconstructions, terrain designed to disorient, and environmental hazards that will require both individual resourcefulness and interspecies cooperation." She paused. She always paused here. The pause was important. "The simulation has a medical override," she added. "If at any point you feel you cannot continue, you say the phrase Protocol Amber and you will be removed. There is no shame in this. 40% of cadets use it, usually within the first 6 hours. More shifting. More nervous antenna movement, a small clicking sound from somewhere in the back that her implant helpfully identified as the stress vocalization of a Drell cadet named Sada Fien, who had apparently come from a family of renowned diplomats and had never, according to his file, been in a situation he could not talk his way out of. "Good luck with the wildlife reconstruction, Sada." Vora scanned the rest of the assembled faces running through her mental catalog. She had learned to spot the ones who would break early, the ones who would surprise her, the ones who would do something quietly competent in hour 30 and make her want to write a commendation. And then her eyes landed on the human. She had known there would be one. The Academy had been admitting humans for only 3 cycles, ever since the Galactic Assembly had finally stopped arguing about whether humanity's application was premature and had accepted the very simple reality that humans were not going away and probably should be trained in a controlled environment rather than left to figure things out independently, which historically had not gone well for anyone involved. His name, according to the file on her slate, was Mako Trell. 22 standard years, which in human terms she understood to be roughly equivalent to a Veth adolescent but which humans themselves considered fully adult, a contradiction she had never entirely resolved. He was of medium height for his species, which meant he was shorter than 12 of the other cadets and taller than 10. He had brown skin, dark eyes, and an expression that she could not immediately classify. Not fear, not bravado. Not the particular glazed look of someone who had already decided this was going to be the worst day of their life. He looked interested. He was looking at the door the way some cadets looked at their food before a long shift. Not with longing exactly. More like he was already making plans for it. Vora made a small note on her slate. Human, watch. She always made that note. With the 3 previous human cadets it had been warranted. One had used Protocol Amber in hour 4, which was not embarrassing by any measure. One had made it to hour 30 before a simulated predator encounter had pushed her over the edge. One had finished the full 48 hours and had come out the other side looking like he had aged a decade, which was honestly a normal result for anyone who survived the full run. But this one was looking at the door like it owed him money. "You will now receive your equipment packs," Vora said, stepping aside so her assistant, a methodical Kreen technician named Pala, could begin distributing the standard-issue survival bundles. "Inside each pack is the same loadout. You are not given more or less based on your species. This is intentional. Part of what you will be tested on is adaptation. A hand went up, a small three-fingered hand belonging to a Veith cadet whose name was Sivo Oren, daughter of a decorated fleet officer according to her file. Eager. Very eager, probably going to be insufferable about it. Yes, Cadet Oren. Instructor, the simulation database lists Grid 7 as having been updated since last cycle. Can you confirm what new environments have been added? Vora smiled. No. Sivo lowered her hand. The room was very quiet for a moment. I can confirm, Vora continued pleasantly, that the updates were significant. She let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable, and then she let it stretch a little more because she had found that silence used correctly was one of the most effective psychological tools available to an educator. Then a sound broke it. A low, quiet laugh. Not panicked, not nervous. The actual, genuine sound of someone finding something funny. She looked at Mako Trell. He was still looking at the door. He had a slight smile on his face and he was shaking his head just barely. The way you might shake your head at something that amused you against your better judgment. Vora stared at him for a moment longer than was professionally necessary. He did not notice, or did not care. Pala finished distributing the packs. Vora gave her final briefing remarks covering the communication protocols, the team structure assignments, the rally points inside the simulation, and the very important reminder that while the simulation's hazards were not physically fatal, the panic response they triggered was very real and very much the point. She reminded them that the grid had no easy zones. She reminded them that the wildlife reconstructions were programmed to behave authentically, which was a polite way of saying that they would hunt you. Then she opened the door. The cadets filed in, one by one, into the gray anteroom that served as the simulation buffer. The door would seal behind them, the grid would initialize, and 48 hours would begin. Mako was near the back of the line. As he passed her, he glanced over. Instructor, he said, his translator rendering the word cleanly, the new environments, are they based on anything real? She looked at him. Yes. From our database or yours. She paused. Primarily ours. He nodded slowly. Okay, he said, with the tone of someone making a small internal adjustment to a plan they already had. Then he walked through the door. Vora stood at the threshold for a moment, watching the sealed portal, listening to the soft hum as the grid began to power up behind it. She went back to her monitoring station. She pulled up the cadet tracking feed, spread across a wall of screens, and found Mako's locator beacon almost immediately. He was near the east edge of the forming group, watching the environment materialize around them with the same quiet, attentive expression he had worn in the briefing room. The grid finished initializing. Grid 7's latest update had included, among other additions, a full atmospheric sequence from a Class D storm world in the Outer Drift. A reconstructed fen zone from a swamp moon with predators that hunted by ground vibration, and a high-altitude section with oxygen levels calibrated to cause significant distress in most species present. Within 4 minutes, 2 cadets were already breathing hard. Within 8, Sodafine, the diplomat's child, had accidentally walked into the vibration-sensitive zone and triggered a predator response that sent half the group scrambling into the dense simulation foliage. Within 11 minutes, a cadet named Rova Sek had called Protocol Amber and been removed. Vora watched all of this on her screens with the practiced calm of someone who had seen it many times. On screen 7, Mako Trell had not scrambled into the foliage. He had stepped sideways behind a large simulated rock formation and was now watching the predator that had emerged from the ground fog with an expression of total, undivided, almost scientific focus. The predator, a reconstruction of a Drell fenstalker, was 3 meters of layered muscle and sensory organs designed to track micro-vibrations in the soil. It moved in slow, deliberate circles, reorienting toward the group of hiding cadets. Mako picked up a small stone. He threw it, with precise and unhurried aim, to the left, about 15 meters out. The stone landed. The fenstalker's entire body snapped toward the sound. It moved away from the hiding cadets, fast and smooth, vanishing into the fog. From inside the foliage, Vora could see Sivo Oren's face on camera 3. She was staring in the direction of Mako's position. Mako stepped out from behind the rock. He looked at the group. He held up one hand and made a slow, clear gesture. Move now. They moved. Vora leaned back in her chair and looked at his file again. Under previous environmental experience, it listed urban, rural, wilderness, 7 documented survival situations, instructor's note from intake review, cadet demonstrates a typically low threat response latency. She had read that phrase 3 weeks ago and filed it without much thought. Now she looked at it again. A typically low threat response latency. That was the Academy's careful, scientific way of saying, this person does not scare as fast as they should. On screen 7, Mako was already scanning the next terrain section. Vora made a longer note on her slate this time. The 48 hours had barely started. By hour 14, Vora Bexon had stopped doing her paperwork. This was unusual. She always did her paperwork during the simulation runs. The monitoring station had a perfectly good desk, a perfectly good filing system, and the simulation was, in her professional experience, entirely predictable enough to manage with one eye while her other eye reviewed cadet intake forms and equipment requisition reports. Not tonight. Tonight both eyes were on the screens. Her assistant Pala had also stopped pretending to organize the equipment logs. He was standing at the edge of the monitoring bank, arms folded, watching screen 7 with the particular stillness of someone who was trying to look casual and failing completely. He has done it again, Pala said. Yes, Vora agreed. That is the 4th time. I am aware, Pala. On screen 7, Mako Trell had just redirected a second predator encounter using nothing more than timing, a handful of displaced gravel, and what appeared to be an extremely relaxed attitude toward very large things with too many teeth. The Fenstalker reconstruction was gone. The group of 11 remaining cadets who had started the simulation as 22 and were now 11 after a wave of Protocol Amber calls through hours 6 to 13, were clustered behind him in a rough formation that had, without any formal announcement or vote, become a deliberate choice. They were following him. Not because he had declared himself a leader, he had not done that, he had not made a speech. He had not produced a plan written on a data slate or called a meeting or used any of the standard team cohesion behaviors that the Academy's training manuals identified as healthy leadership indicators. He had simply kept being right, quietly, at the correct moment, every time something went wrong. And apparently that was enough because the other cadets had started watching where he moved before they moved themselves, and that was the oldest and most honest form of leadership Vora had ever seen. Sivo Oren was on his left. She had stopped being insufferable about 48 minutes into the simulation, which was a personal record for Academy cadets from decorated fleet families. Vora had documented this. The Fen Swamp had a way of adjusting people's priorities. Sada Fiend was still present, which genuinely surprised her. The diplomat's child had made it past hour 6, past hour 10, past hour 12. He was not thriving exactly. He was operating at the level of a person who had decided through gritted teeth and sheer stubbornness that he was not going to be the person who quit. His color had gone through approximately 7 different shades of stress response and had settled, somewhere around hour 9, on a dull, determined gray. And then there was the high-altitude section. Vora had been watching the group approach it for the last 2 hours on the terrain tracking overlay. The high-altitude zone was the simulation's most recent addition, and she was, privately, quite proud of it. The oxygen saturation in that section was set to 62% of standard, which was sufficient to keep all species present alive and functional, but which was also, for most of them, deeply, physically unpleasant. It caused dizziness, labored breathing, slowed cognition, and a general sensation that many cadets described afterward as being wrapped slowly in wet cloth. It was, in the language of the simulation design team, a cognitive pressure environment. In the language of every cadet who had ever gone through it, it was something considerably less polished. The group hit the altitude threshold at hour 15. Within 90 seconds, Vora could see the physiological responses spreading through the group on the biomonitor feeds. Heart rates climbing, respiration patterns changing. The Veth cadets who had the most efficient respiratory systems in the group were managing best. The Drell were struggling. Soda Fiend had gone from determined gray to something approaching institutional beige again. Mako Trell's biomonitor read as follows: heart rate elevated by 11%, respiration adjusted, no further significant changes. Vora stared at that readout. 11%, adjusted respiration. That was it. For comparison, every other cadet in the group was showing between 30 and 60% cardiovascular elevation. 3 of them were at the edge of the biomonitor's yellow threshold. She pulled up his intake medical file for the second time that evening. She had looked at it briefly before the simulation began, noted the standard human parameters, and moved on. She looked at it more carefully now. Under environmental stress history, there was a long list, a very long list. It included high-altitude exposure, multiple instances. She cross-referenced the altitudes listed. They were higher than what the simulation was currently running. She sat back. Of course, humans, from the Deathworld. She had known this in the abstract, intellectual way that you knew things you had read in a briefing document once. Humans came from a planet with a remarkably aggressive biosphere and a wide range of atmospheric and gravitational conditions across its surface. They had spent their entire evolutionary history on a world that was, by most civilized galactic standards, completely unreasonable. The simulation, she was suddenly and somewhat uncomfortably realizing, was built from a database of environments collected from 47 worlds across the galaxy. None of those 47 worlds were Earth. At hour 17, Mako stopped the group at the edge of the altitude zone's second tier, which she had never seen any group reach before because groups usually spent hours 15 through 18 simply managing the first tier. He turned to face them and said something that her audio feed picked up clearly. "Breathe slower, not faster. Your body thinks it needs more air, and it is wrong. Slower and deeper. Give it 30 seconds. There was a pause. Then Sivo Oren, who was looking distinctly unwell, said, "How are you not affected?" He thought about it for a moment. "Mountains," he said, as though that were a complete sentence. It apparently was, because she seemed to accept it. Vora made a note. Human considers mountain exposure a self-explanatory answer. Follow up in post-simulation debrief. At hour 21, the storm sequence activated. This was the section Vora was most proud of, and also the section that statistically produced the most protocol amber calls. The storm was drawn from the atmospheric records of a Class D world called Veth Minor, which had winds capable of reaching 200 kilometers per hour at ground level and an electrical discharge pattern that could produce lightning strikes at intervals of less than 4 seconds during peak activity. The simulation could not replicate actual lightning for obvious reasons, but it could replicate the sound, the light, the pressure change, and the electromagnetic interference that scrambled communications and navigation tools. Most cadets found this extremely disorienting. Vora had designed it to be extremely disorienting. She was good at her job. 2 more protocol amber calls came in during the first 20 minutes of the storm sequence. She logged them without surprise. On screen 7, Mako Trell was doing something she had never seen a cadet do in the storm sequence in 11 cycles of running it. He was smiling. Not the panicked, involuntary species stress response grin that some species produced in high-threat situations. Not the empty expression of someone who had gone somewhere else in their head to get through it. An actual, quiet, real smile. The kind you produced when something reminded you of something else, something that had been hard once and was now just a memory you carried comfortably. He said something to Sivo, who was pressed against a rock formation beside him, and her audio feed caught it between 2 bursts of simulated thunder. "This is actually not that bad," he said. Sivo stared at him. "Compared to what?" she said. It was not a question. It was the voice of someone who had decided that some things were not worth arguing about. "There is a place on my planet called the Pacific Coast," he said, still watching the storm with that same relaxed attention. "This is smaller." Sivo made a sound that her translator identified as disbelieving vocalization. Vora felt a deep and professional sympathy for the girl. By hour 30, 7 cadets remained. 3 of the 7 were showing significant biomonitor stress indicators but had made the clear decision to push through. One of the 7 was Sota Fiend, who had gone past gray and come out the other side into something that read, remarkably, as determined. His readings were bad. He was functioning anyway. Vora made a personal note to mention this to his intake advisor. And Mako Trell, who had readings that continued to be bafflingly nearly normal. At hour 33, the final section of the simulation activated. It was called, in the internal design documentation, the Convergence Zone. Vora had built it specifically to combine all the previous environmental stressors simultaneously: high altitude, storm conditions, active predator presence, terrain instability. It was not, strictly speaking, a situation that existed anywhere in the known galaxy. It was a collection of worst cases assembled into a single pressure point, and its purpose was not to defeat cadets but to show them that they could keep moving even when every system around them was hostile at once. Most groups collapsed to their final protocol amber calls here. The 7 remaining cadets entered the convergence zone at hour 33 and 14 minutes. Vora watched. Pala had stopped even pretending to stand casually and was now simply staring at the screens with his full and undivided attention. The group moved through the convergence zone in a configuration that Mako had arranged them in roughly 40 minutes earlier. The 3 highest stress cadets were in the center. Sivo and a Kreen cadet named Brek Ovan, who had turned out to have a remarkable sense of spatial orientation, were on the flanks. Sotfin was at the rear, which was both a position of vulnerability and a position of responsibility, and he had accepted it without complaint, which told Vora everything she needed to know about what 33 hours inside a simulation had done for his development. Mako was at the front. He moved through the convergence zone the way she imagined water moved through obstacles, not fighting the terrain, reading it, choosing routes that were not obvious, resting the group at moments when the storm pattern briefly eased, redirecting twice when the predator reconstruction picked up their trail, and doing all of this with the particular quality of someone who was not performing competence but simply had it. At hour 41, one more cadet called Protocol Amber. 6 remained. At hour 44, in a section of the convergence zone that Vora privately considered her most ruthless design decision, the terrain destabilized completely. Simulated ground collapse, environmental chaos, 0 navigation reference points, and peak storm activity all at once. She watched her screens. She watched Mako Trell stand completely still in the middle of it for approximately 8 seconds, which was not the behavior she expected, and then do something she had genuinely never seen in 11 cycles. He sat down, on the destabilizing ground, in the storm, with everything going wrong around him. He sat down, put both hands flat on the surface, closed his eyes, and was still for about 4 seconds. Sivo, beside him, looked panicked. "What are you doing?" "Feeling which way the ground is moving," he said, without opening his eyes. A pause. "Can you do that?" Sivo said. "Yes." He opened his eyes, pointed left and slightly south. "That way. Move." They moved. He was right. At hour 48, the simulation ended. The lights shifted from the harsh, variable storm tones of the convergence zone to the flat, neutral gray of the grid's standby state. The sounds cut. The environmental systems powered down. The predator reconstructions dissolved back into base data. 6 cadets were still standing in the grid. Vora unsealed the door. They walked out. Some of them were barely walking. Sodafine came through the door looking like he had been rinsed through a particularly aggressive weather system, which was accurate, and he had the specific expression of someone who had survived something and had not yet decided how to feel about it. Vora noted each of them as they passed her, doing the quick professional assessment she always did at the end of the run. Condition, stability, disposition, signs of distress that would require follow-up. Then Mako came through. He looked tired. Actually tired in a way he had not looked at hour 17 or hour 33. He looked like a person at the end of a long effort, and there was something about that, the fact that 48 hours had produced this rather than the hollow flatness she sometimes saw in cadets who had pushed too far, that she found quietly significant. He looked at her. "Instructor," he said. "Good simulation." She considered several possible responses. "It was designed," she said, "from the most hostile environments in our galactic database." He nodded, and there was a beat, and then he said pleasantly, "You should add Earth." She looked at him for a long moment. "Noted," she said. He walked past her toward the debrief room. Vora stood at the threshold of the simulation chamber for a moment, looking at the powered-down grid. Then she picked up her data slate and opened a new document. Subject, Curriculum Review Request, Grid 7 Expansion. She began to type. She had 11 cycles of simulation design behind her. She had faced every species the galaxy had produced. She had built environments that broke people down so they could be rebuilt stronger. She had never, not once, considered adding a human reference world to the database. She was considering it now. She typed for 3 minutes, then stopped, reread what she had written, and added one final line to the document. Recommendation. Pending approval, the following environmental data package should be incorporated into Grid 7's permanent rotation. Classification of Source World. Class D. Common name, Earth. Advisory note for future cadets: do not assume familiarity, do not assume limitation, and if the human in your group sits down in the middle of a storm and puts his hands on the ground, let him. He knows something you do not. She saved the document, closed the slate, and went to run her debrief.